Looking for tips to improve your quilting accuracy? Why not try sewing a scant 1/4 inch seam? Many quilters prefer this seam in place of a regular 1/4 inch seam, especially when sewing intricate patchwork blocks. In this video, you'll learn how to calibrate this seam while constructing a rail fence block. You'll also learn how to check your block's accuracy, which is so important in quilting. Last but not least, you'll get to review some other methods that you might like to try out when making this block. Ready to get started? You can download these patterns for free at learnhowtoquilt.com under the Saturday Sampler class. A scant 1/4 inch seam is about a thread's width away from a 1/4 inch seam. Pardon this marker here, it sort of bled on my fabric, but I'm hoping that you can see that this seam is just a thread over from a regular 1/4 inch seam. Often when you press, there's a little fabric here that gets caught up on this thread hump. It's about a thread's width. So if you move over about a thread's width, your patchwork will be more precise. For this block, you'll need 3 scraps of fabric at least 2.5 by 6.5 inches big. Whether you use scraps of fabric or yardage, you always want to make sure to press your fabric before cutting. You can cut all 3 at once using a rotary cutter, or cut each individually using scissors and a template. Remember, when cutting rectangles, you want these edges to fall on the grain lines. When everything's been cut, you can use your pattern as a way of double checking your pieces. Lay out your block. Take 2 rectangles and put right sides together. Get into the habit of putting a clip or a pin on the side that's to be sewn. I always hold that side in my hand and then place that side next to my machine's foot. Before I sew this together, I want to adjust my sewing machine to sew that scant 1/4 inch. On my graph paper, I've drawn a line maybe about 2 threads over. I'm going to use this to help figure out where I need my fabric to fall when using this 1/4 inch foot. I lined up the horizontal lines on my graph paper with the guideline here. I've got my needle down about 1 thread width over from this 1/4 inch blue line, and I can see that if I want to sew a scant 1/4 inch, I'll have to move my fabric just a little bit over on this guideline. And if I decide that I want to use this tape to help make my job a little bit easier, then I'll have to move that tape over to that position. And when everything's been set, I'm ready to sew. I like to start with a little scrap of fabric that I call my leader. I'm using a regular stitch length and red thread, so you can see you'll want to use a neutral color of thread when you're sewing patchwork pieces. I've already put right sides together. I know that this is the side that I'm going to sew. I'm going to hold that in my hand, and I like to check to make sure that each corner is lined up. Not only this side, but every one of the corners to keep everything nice and straight. So I'll be sewing on this seam. I don't like to use pins. If you don't feel comfortable not using pins, then it's okay to pin this side to keep everything in line. And notice my fabric is not up against that 1/4 inch guide. It's just over a thread or so. At the end, I like to sew off onto what I call a follower, another scrap of fabric. Here's my scant 1/4 inch. The black line is the 1/4 inch line, and the red line is the scant 1/4 inch seam. I've taken my second piece, I've lined up the side to be sewn. I've also lined up these edges. I even check to see if these corners match up, because if you have everything in line, you'll be more accurate. I've started in on my leader, and I'll continue sewing. When I get to the end, I'll sew off onto my follower. I've put this here as a reminder that your accuracy depends on not only cutting and sewing, but also your pressing. Sometimes I like to use a towel on my pressing surface, but it's not necessary. First, I like to register the seams by pressing down, and this causes the threads to sort of nestle down into the fabric, and it helps with that thread hump that you get when pressing. Then I'll press to the dark. Then I'll repeat with the second seam. Remember, you want to press using an up and down motion, not a back and forth motion. Now check your center rectangle for accuracy. Don't worry if you're off a thread or two. It might take a little more practice to get that perfect seam. If you're off by more than 1/8 to 1/4 inch, then you'll have to go back, retrace your steps to fix the problem. Hope you decide to make this rail fence block. It's very versatile. It can stand alone in a sampler quilt, make up a larger block, or be used in a whole quilt. It's also a good block to try out different techniques to see which one suits your sewing style. So if making one block seems time-consuming, try strip piecing to speed up the process. Sew strips together and then cut into squares for a fast quilt. If you're having trouble with precision, paper piecing is a wonderful sewing technique to aid in getting accurate seams. No matter what method you choose, make sure you sew it accurately. You decide which seam works best for you. Try to get in the habit of always checking your block size before moving on in your project. If you've been following this series, you've now completed 4 different blocks. In the next video, you'll get some tips for matching intersections while making this 4-patch block. Thank you for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please share our series with your friends.